welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the virtual edition of The Value of Words, an international arts and literature festival based in Dehradun in the Doon Valley. And this is the fourth edition, but the first virtual edition of this festival, of the literature festival online. In this era of the pandemic. So nonetheless, it's fantastic that we are able to meet and use this virtual platform to carry on and have host this virtual festival, The Value of Words. And it's a great pleasure today to welcome our speaker and author for this session, Dr. Tr Shankaraman. So welcome, Shankar, to this session. And I also welcome the chair to the session, Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, the director of the Wildlife Institute of India. So I'll just take a minute to briefly introduce both our members of the session of the panel today. So I'll start with you, Shankar, and of course, to many of us, you are no stranger, and are we know you from maybe 2 decades or even longer for many people, but you're now of course well known to a lot of nature lovers and readers across India as a writer. And I just wanted to say that you are a wildlife scientist as well as a writer, and you live and work in a landscape of rainforests and of course human land use in the Animalai Hills in the Western Ghats in southern India. And your connection, of course, we all three of us here at the session today have a connection to the Doon Valley, to Dehradun, and you were a master's student at the Wildlife Institute of India, over 2 decades back now, and you went on to do your doctoral research in the Western Ghats. And like I said, you have been a wildlife scientist turned, as you say in your own words, turned writer turned wildlife scientist. So you were a founder member along with your friends and colleagues from some of them from the Wildlife Institute of India of the Nature Conservation Foundation, NCF, based founded in Mysore. And you were one of amongst the stalwarts in setting up this tremendously successful in many ways organization, which is now more than, again, nearly 3 decades old. And we'll, as we move on with the session, we'll come to, of course, discuss your writings, your particular book, The Wild Heart of India, as well as other issues close to your heart. Allow me to now briefly introduce our chair of the session today, Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, the director of the Wildlife Institute of India. And Dr. Dhananjay Mohan is an Indian Forest Service officer with now, again, over 3 decades of experience, having joined the service in 1988. And he is currently in Dehradun as director of the institute. And he is somebody who has also a deep connection with the Doon valleys, with the Himalayas and Uttarakhand, having spent his formative years there. And again, brings with him his experience as a professional forester, but also someone who's deeply interested in research, in wildlife science, and bridges both the worlds of management of forests and protected areas, as well as the science of studying nature and wildlife, and having a deep connection there with a relationship as well. So with that, I welcome everybody, all our listeners on the session, and over to Dr. Mohan, to our chair, to say a few words before we initiate our discussion.
Thank you, Malvika, and wonderful to be here on this session today with Dr. Shankaraman. And of course, we're going to talk about his book, the collection of essays, The Wild Heart of India. But of course, this is an opportunity for us to interact not just on the book, but a lot of issues or a lot of matters which are there in the book, and which have, I think, a great value in shaping conservation in India and elsewhere for that matter. So I really look forward to this interaction, and it's I think even though we may not have interacted much, me and Shankar, uh, personally, but I think through the writings and all, I've read so many of his scientific papers, the research papers that he's written. And of course, there are not very many people who have written so extensively, particularly on birds and their ecology in India. And some of the finest writings which have been done by him, which are referred to by all researchers, and particularly those who work on the birds. So, but this is a very different facet of Shankar, where you've written a popular book. And I must say that uh, it's somewhat rare to find this combination of outstanding scientist who is also very good in coming up with a popular writing based on the scientific research. I mean, I would recollect writings of people like Schaller, who have uh, done remarkable work on wildlife science. But at the same time, I mean, one of the best books written on natural history, particularly of the Indian subcontinent, I consider as Stones of Silence by Schaller. And it's a travelogue. It's so nice and it connects with the science. And that's the beauty. It's popular, but at the same time, contains science in a very nice manner, a very perceivable manner, a very understandable manner. So I think uh, I put this publication of yours, this popular writing collection of essays, somewhat in that league. And it's really heartening to see this kind of writing coming from a scientist of your caliber. So I think over the next 45 minutes to an hour, we'll know more about this book from directly from you. And I think this is what everybody is looking forward to. So I think with these words, over to you, Malvika, to take the things forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Mohan. Yes, Shankar.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation to participate in this, the Valley of Words Lit Fest, and for that very generous introduction from you, Malvika and Dhananjai. I think I don't know if I deserve all that you said, but it's something that I have been grappling with, both to understand nature, both as a scientist and as a writer. And I think that's what has also come into my book. But we can talk about a little more about that today. But I just wanted to thank you for that very warm and generous introduction that you gave.
Yeah. Thank you, Shankar. So, like we said, we're here, of course, to talk about your book, The Wild Heart of India, but also then broaden it out to issues which concern nature writing, but also conservation, to look at how that how writing can contribute to the conservation of nature. But I just wanted to say that yes, for those of our readers who and people listening in who have read your book and would know, but just to say that your book, of course, is sort of what you say, your own, your trajectory of your personal and professional change, in a way, your experiences as a scientist, as a field biologist, and your experiences with actually, conservation projects on the ground. And the book progresses in that fashion, leading to sort of your essays, which are more reflective, deeper reflections on nature, on place, on ethics, right? And you ask initially, when you share your experiences as a young schoolboy, really growing up in the city of Chennai, what was then Madras. So you take us along with you, as it were. The reader sort of walks with you through the metropolis of Chennai, and your experiences as a young student in Gindi National Park, in this urban green space in the city of Chennai, and then of course as a graduate student at the Wildlife Institute of India in Dehradun. And from then on, your research took you to the Northeast, it took you to Mizoram, your doctoral research and your work, your postdoctoral work, as well as your on-ground conservation work in the Western Ghats, in the Animalais. So as a reader, I mean, I'd like to say that yes, I was really you invited us to imagine that we are walking with you through these trails, and we saw and we smelled and we felt the same sights and of these magnificent landscapes, really awe-inspiring, and at the same time something which forged a very deep connection with you. So we could, it resonated with many of us, or we imagined or tried to imagine this very deep connection with the nature that you forged from a young schoolboy to a professional now of many years of standing. So I just wondered whether again you feel that sort of, it was really in your formative years, this sort of being able to access such places and people. You mentioned some people as well, who've had who made a real impression on you, and in through your young age and even later. So I wonder if when you talk of forging these sort of relationships or trying to bring people closer to nature, what you feel is the role of such having access to such places, and how that plays. And I would later turn to the chair also for his for Dr. Mohan's inputs. But yeah, Shankar, I mean, because that's what I felt was
Yeah.
a key part of your of you, or what came through to me as a reader of your book. This the relationship, the very personal connection with nature that one has or could forge, really.
Yeah. I think you're very right, and I must say that these different places that I have worked in have had a very strong and very formative influence on me, and they're all wonderful places. It's not that they have always been remote areas that very few people get to go to. Although some, I did work in some really remote parts of India, like in northeastern India and Mizoram and so on. But even within
Yeah.
Chennai city, there are such wonderful places, and that's something that I tried to bring out in the book, that you don't really necessarily have to see nature as something that is always out there somewhere far away, that you have to go on a vacation to see. It's all around you. And as a child, when I began bird watching, it was literally just in my backyard, and it's right there in my backyard. There was so much that I didn't know existed before then. And I think those early years had these two different influences. One was that there is so much out there that that is there for us to learn more about. And secondly, that when you get interested in nature, you also start to notice more. I think as a naturalist, whether it is learning to identify birds or a tree or a flower, you're trained to notice the slight differences between species and so on. And that really opens your eyes to how much is out there. That nature is actually very vibrant, and a little bit of that, trying to capture some of that and bring it into my writing was really the challenge that I grappled with. So when you say that you felt like you were walking with me through these places, and you could feel and you could hear the birds, and you could literally be there, that was something that I aspired to do, because these places are remarkable, and they're all around us, whether it's in a city or whether it's in the countryside, or whether it's far away inside a national park, or a far away wildlife sanctuary. There is so much that we can see as well as learn from nature, but it requires us to be to open eyes and to be sort of sensitive to it, and to let to feel that you're also part of nature, and it's not something that is away from you and somewhere far away. So I don't know if that answers your question, but having places like these
Yes.
are really important. And I think in today's world, where a lot of people, particularly in urban areas, feel more disconnected from nature, it's worth reiterating that it is there if you care to pay attention. And that's what I also learned, and that's what I was also trying to convey in the book.
Yes, absolutely. And, I'd say for Dr. Dhananjay Mohan as well, that having, grown up in the Sylvan Doon Valley and his years at growing up in the Forest Research Institute, and then you graduated as an engineer from IIT, but then you chose to come back to the forest, as it were, to join the Forest Service. You did your own doctoral research in an, if I can call it, an urban forest or a forest in an urban setting in the Dehradun Valley. So, do you think that played a role in your choices, the choices you made in life, the path that you eventually took and pursued, and how you view that, Dr. Mohan?
Yeah, actually, I can see broad similarity what Shankar went through in his early days in his life and what I went through. Uh, of course, I was perhaps in a richer place, being in the Forest Research Institute campus, growing up there. But I cannot agree more with him that if you have an eye, if you have an interest, you can find a lot of interesting things in your backyard, even in some of the most urbanized places, and particularly in a country like ours. uh, I mean, everywhere in your backyard you can find birds, you can find butterflies, you can find some interesting plants. And once you start, I mean, it could start with any of the things. I mean, for many people, in fact, who get introduced to nature, often I would say birds are the first step. But nowadays things are changing. You find people who may start off with butterflies or with something else, trees or something. But then you start on a journey of discovery, and you find so much. It just bewilders you, actually, that what all you miss, you've been missing prior to that. And I think that is what drives us forward in this journey. And as Shankar said, I can't again agree more with him. Your power of observation, that skill, that improves substantially. And I would extend it to other things also. I mean, even in other matters of life, not really nature, I think you become far more observant, you become far more careful. And so these are some, I would say, spin-offs from being a good naturalist or a person who observes nature very keenly. But yes, of course, penning it down in such interesting manner is an art which I don't think everybody can do. So I think you can be a good naturalist, but at the same time you can be a good nature writer. Well, uh, that doesn't happen. That's, I would say, maybe partly upbringing, partly gifted, a mixture of the two, and of course knowledge base. So I think, and that is what leads to such interesting and nice publications. But yes, I think the good part is, I think in those days, in the 80s or even in 90s, there weren't very many people who were actually getting introduced to nature. But now things have changed, and that's a welcome change. I find so many younger people getting into observing nature very keenly all around us. Of course, there's a very large share which are still blind to these things. Uh, but I think that percentage, that share in our society, particularly in the younger generation, I think there is a new burst of outdoors, interest in outdoors in the country, and that, which is wonderful, I think. And there's still a lot in our country that generally the picture painted is that we have lost everything. And but I would quite disagree with that. Yes, there have been losses, there are problems, there are issues, but there is still a lot in our country, even in our backyards. So I think a writing of this kind can actually uh, promote people to get and explore the world around them, the nature around them. And I think that is the biggest takeaway, biggest gift that this writing and similar writings actually do. So, I mean, that is why I think this is a very important milestone in nature writing in India, this particular creation by Shankar. So thank you, Shankar, for this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and just to second what you said, it also poses challenges to a writer. How do you convey all that a place carries, or even a single species that you're writing about? Often poses challenges to a writer. There is only so much that you can bring in from a purely scientific perspective, and there's a risk that it becomes too dry, and you sort of not only lose the interest of the reader, but you're also not conveying the full depth of what a place or a particular species carries. And that's something that I've grappled with right through this book as well.
All right.
Yes, Shankar. And I mean, also what I found throughout your narrative, and touching upon what Dr. Mohan also says, that, the sort of, once you observe and you start to immerse yourself in nature in a way, that's when the empathy, you build an empathy, and for nature and all its forms, and I found that sort of running deep through your narrative, a respect as well as a deep empathy basically for nature and all its forms, and including humans in all diversity, in all forms, including humans. And in your work, as well as a scientist, as a conservationist in the Western Ghats, you speak of the importance of course, one, as you said, not, it's not just science in terms of science helping to achieve what you want to see as a conservation outcome. It's also here you're talking about your writing, but I was also interested because as part of your book, you move on from your early experiences as a field biologist to actual sort of your forays into conservation action, so to speak. So how was, what kind of experiences did you draw there with your colleagues, with Divya Mudappa, with your colleagues from NCF, in trying to forge, of course, your personal connect with nature very much there throughout your book, but also reaching out to people and working with people across, from people who are from the local communities, to working with companies and corporate houses and so on your your mission to bring back the forest, as it were, for trying to restore, doing ecological restoration in the animalized. So if you could share some of your experiences from that.
Yeah. So, in the opening of this book, I quote from Aldo Leopold, whose book, The Sand County Almanac, is a book I, keep going back to. And Leopold says that one of the perils of an ecological education is that it opens your eyes to a world of wounds. And to an extent, that happened to me as well. And it would probably happen to anyone who, like we spoke earlier, begins to pay attention to nature around them, to really understand what is out there. And then immediately you start seeing what is happening to things that you have only begun to know. Places that you cherished, which are, disappearing or being built over, species that are declining, and so on. And that happened fairly rapidly, right through my, early years, from when I began my field research in Gindi National Park as a bachelor student, or certainly in the Wildlife Institute as a master student, when we were exposed to many different parts of India and the wider conservation issues. So it does open your eyes that if these things are valuable, you will also have to somehow work towards conservation. It's not something that you can just let go and turn your eyes away. You can't be blind to it anymore. And again, I was very fortunate because I have had the privilege of working with my partner Divya Mudappa here, and my other colleagues in NCF, so many of whom work here in the Western Ghats, but they also work in other parts of India. And it is through their experiences that I have learned so much more about the different ecosystems in India, the different kinds of people who live in those ecosystems, and what are the threats that those areas are facing. And each area has its own challenges, and they are very different. It's very important to pay attention to the local context, to to learn from the people who are living there, to respect their perspectives, and then is when you can translate what you have learned into action. So your training as a scientist, although it is important uh, uh, to understand what's going on, is not sufficient. Anyone who's a conservationist will learn that pretty quickly. You may be trained in the best institutes in the country to do the best science, but when you try and translate that on the ground to bring about change, you have to grapple with so many issues. You have to change your perspective. You have to learn to work with people and so on. And in the Western Ghats, it meant working with corporate companies that own large chunks of land which are now under plantations, but earlier were under rainforests. So how can we protect the patches of forest that are left? How can we take areas that are degraded and bring them back through restoration? We also learn a lot from the tribal people who live here, who have lived here for generations. Most of our field work, and this is often not acknowledged or easily visible when you read our scientific papers, but there is always the local people and who are very knowledgeable, who have been with us and who have sort of guided us in the field. My friends Madhuri Ramesh and Manish Chandy have written a lovely book. It's called Walking is a Way of Knowing. And that is the title. And it's also about the philosophy, so to speak, of the Kadar people, the indigenous people who live in the rainforest here, who spend so much time in the field. They're not using scientific methods like us, or they're not using our binoculars and gadgets perhaps, but just by walking in the forest, by spending generation, year on year, and then over generations learning about the place, they have a very deep embedded knowledge about these places. So to draw from all of this, to draw from people like that, to draw from the local context, to know how different ecosystems vary and so on is really a big challenge in conservation. But it's really necessary to try and do all of that. And it's not something any single person can do. So that's why we work as a team here. And most of my colleagues in NCF who do conservation work in other parts of the country, they work as teams. The Wildlife Institute has teams working in different parts of India because it's a very complex and difficult issue by and large. And then there is how you write about it as well, to bring all these dimensions into writing and to convey that conservation is not so simple as, okay, here is a problem that we've identified and this is what needs to be done. It's not as simple as that.
Yes, quite right, Shankar. And I mean, I'm sure Dr. Mohan would agree as a professional from the forest services, and how I'm sure they grapple in a way with this challenge of learning to constructively engage with people on the ground, with communities, in terms of how to better manage, how to protect, manage these forests and grasslands, or the landscapes that a forester is tasked with doing. So I'm sure with Dr. Mohan's perspectives and experience in as a manager of protected areas, as a forester, some of what you're saying, a lot of it would also be something that he has, so you would have dealt with in your own professional life.
Yes, very right, Malvika. See, again, since Shankar is not just a scientist, he is a practitioner, he's a ground practitioner, so he felt this. What happens normally is most of the people working on some aspect of science, it could be social science, it could be ecological science or anything else. So they go to an area, they look at only the aspect that they are concerned with, come back, write about it scientifically. But when you actually start doing things on the ground, then you encounter a whole lot of things much beyond your core area of competence or the field you've been trained into, specialized into. And that's the time when you realize that working on the ground is a very different ball game. And you got to be understanding the communities, you got to be understanding the bureaucracy even around you. You have to be, gelling with the, as he said, corporates, the whole lot of stakeholders. And to actually succeed in doing, to achieve success on the ground, everything has to be balanced. It's actually a balancing game. uh, Everybody will have his or her own priority. I'm talking of the stakeholders, and how to balance all that with the overarching objective of conservation. That is the key thing, and to achieve that is very difficult. And only those, this is something which you can only feel when you actually start doing things on the ground, when you actually start dirtying your hands. From outside it looks very different. And I'm so happy that you don't get this kind of combination again. Somebody who's actually trained as a scientist actually trying to go and do things on the ground. Not many people try that. And they do excel in their field. I don't say that that's wrong and they should be actually doing things. See, everything has its own value. So, but this is maybe particularly in a country like ours, there's a lot to be done on the ground, and that is why this becomes valuable, this kind of work, this kind of contribution, and having such a strong linkage of science. From the kind of work that Shankar has taken up in the Anamlai Hills. Now, these are models which can be actually, I wouldn't say can be copied to other places, but definitely you can learn a lot and maybe modify them suitably to various places. And perhaps that is where the role of government comes in a big way. Because when you have to take these things on a larger area, larger platform, that is where the role of the government only perhaps can achieve this. And that is where I think a linkage between this kind of good work and the government agencies, that can be very crucial. And so but the critical thing is that what very often a large section of our educated society tend to miss is that doing things on the ground is very different from what appears from a distance. And I think that gap, if it is appreciated by people, that will help. And I think maybe the writings of this kind can help bridge that gap, because otherwise most of the people don't get an opportunity to get this feel directly. They have to depend on writings of others, and bulk of those writings are done again by people who are not practitioners. So that actually tends to distort the viewpoint of the masses, the majority. And so to change that, to attack that rather, we need writings by actual practitioners. And that is again why this writings of this kind become extremely important to achieve ground conservation. And I think everybody would agree that in a country like ours, we need to achieve a lot on ground conservation. Not that we haven't achieved, we have achieved quite a lot, but I think miles to go in this direction.
I think also in your book, again, in the second part where you talk about, as you say, your forays into conservation, to trying to make things happen on the ground, and what Dr. Mohan just talked about, to be a sort of practitioner really. And as you said, you mentioned the wounds, across when you look at landscapes and look at it from a larger perspective, or at a finer scale. So one might say that perhaps it's a landscape, if not ridden with wounds, that might be too strong a term to use, but they certainly are there to different extents. And you speak of the need to forge, like I said, connections, relationships amongst also different groups of people, what Dr. Mohan was also just saying. And how, particularly in terms of when you look at, the natural foundations that we have, and it's an interesting thought that you ask your readers to try bringing in that how we think of infrastructure in terms of the built infrastructure that we bring in humans, if you might say artificially. But you argue for a sort of attitudinal frame shift in a way, right? Where you say that we should look at our natural foundation as that core infrastructure really, and look at what we are doing in terms of, like I said, all the sort of built infrastructure, whether it's roads and rails and so on, that we need to, or we think we need to support economic development, to look at these as superstructures built over these, the natural foundations as the real infrastructure. So I wondered about, you do discuss it in your book to great level of detail, and what you believe is the scale and severity of it, but also importantly what you think can be done about it, and especially, like you and Dr. Dhananjay Mohan are both saying, I think in terms of ecologists, scientists coming together with engineers, with technocrats, bureaucrats, with people from the local community on the ground to companies and so on. So, like I said, what you think is hopefully already perhaps steps in the right direction, or which way one could channel these sorts of efforts. So, just your thoughts on that, Shankar.
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go, and it's a very, very important topic, and I felt compelled to write about it because perhaps there was a time in the distant past when there were other kinds of threats that were more imminent. For instance, there could be species that were being directly persecuted and so on. But in the recent past, and this is not just true of India, it's true of other developing countries, it's true of even the developed world. Among the major threats are this rapid proliferation of infrastructure development. There is we now have a neoliberal environment where development for economic growth kind of takes precedence over almost anything else, including the environmental foundations on which all of us rely on. So there is this massive growth in building of roads, in building of power lines, in building of railways. There are also proposed hundreds of dams that are proposed and so on. And I just wanted to question this notion that this is what is infrastructure. It might be easy in some cases to quantify, what a road does, or how much power could be generated from a dam, etc. But often on the other side, there are these very serious costs that often people are not looking at all, or have not considered adequately. When a dam submerges an entire ecosystem to generate power, which is then exported to some other faraway place. There are people living just near the dam who don't get electricity, but you're exporting it somewhere else, because that's how the economics works out. Or things that are more insidious. So, for instance, with the roads and power lines, they look like fairly, harmless things. There's just a narrow road going through the forest, or a power line that's cutting through the forest. What could go wrong? But as I write about in the book, there are a whole range of factors that come into play, and how it affects ecosystems, how it affects forests. It leads to fragmentation, and it leads to direct loss of wildlife through roadkills and electrocution and so on. So it is definitely a huge issue, and I wanted to flag it because, like Dhananjay was saying earlier, this is an issue that in conservation involves very, very different stakeholders. You're talking about different government departments. There's highways, there is forest department, there's the electricity boards, there are engineers, there are contractors, there are scientists, there are conservationists, there are local people also who are often affected by these roads. And what I wanted to question was two things. One is, should we accept these unquestioningly as always good for the nation or for development? I don't think so. sometimes when you balance the equation, you find that the costs overweigh whatever limited benefits that come from that infrastructure. And the second thing is, how do we sensitize all these different stakeholders to the issues so that they can come up with solutions that are not as harmful? Maybe a road can be realigned around a vital corridor or a protected area. Maybe there is a way in which engineers can devise solutions that are less harmful and less damaging to the environment than some of these structures are. I think the Wildlife Institute of India has led the way in some of this. They have produced training and manuals that would guide this. But I think we have a long way to go before, for instance, there is a good understanding among the engineers about ecology in India. These are two groups that work almost independently of each other. There is not as much conversation between them or even common understanding between these groups. And it's very vital if we are to talk about conservation in present day India. And that's something that I wanted to write about, and I wanted to write it in a way that people will understand what the issues are at stake and how these can have significant influences.
Yes, right, Shankar. And
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, you dwell upon that, and you yourself have also, in terms of research and documentation, you have worked on this aspect very closely along with your colleagues at the NCF. So that's certainly something which we see playing out across not just India, but like you said, other parts of the world, developing or developed, and that's where this sort of tremendous need and scope also for people from various parts of walks of life to come together to actually make sure things go the right way, and how we could really make things better. And taking it from there, from as your book progresses, from these sort of issues that you grapple with as a practitioner, trying to achieve on-ground conservation. As the reader, as one reads on, progresses on through your book, like I said, the sense of that deep empathy, it runs strong deeply through the entire narrative, but particularly towards the third part, which is of your book, which is really very reflective, and where you reflect upon our place in nature, as it were, and what sort of impels you to sort of think through these waves of thought into a consciousness of what it means to be. So it's deeply reflective, that part of your book, and again it urges the reader also to we sort of pause, and that's what you do as well. When you speak of even experiences, you pull out from your experience, your memory of certain which might seems like many numerous but yet important instances of that urge you to reflect, that urge you to sort of pause and think and look back and think about your place in the scheme of things. So it occurred to me that whilst you bring a reader who might even be interested but not quite have had an opportunity to immerse oneself so closely as you've been able to do over since you were a young boy, really, and now as a writer. So I wondered what where you see the role really of nature writing, particularly in India, in the Indian context, in trying to support conservation through this at one level of very trying to forge this sort of very personal connection with nature, at the same time trying to make readers aware of what the pressing issues are really, and how one can do that at one's own individual level, but also more collectively perhaps. And as you mentioned yourself, that you think an approach built on science alone cannot really help conservation. So where do you see then this sort of where nature writing comes in? And like I said, you say the need, the foundations of a conservation ethic really, which must be tempered by empathy. So how do you think writers in particular can contribute to that? And what's at the moment? What is the status of nature writing in India, and where the scope is really to help support or help see the kind of conservation that you as a person, as a scientist, as a person with a deep empathy with nature would like to see?
That's a tough one. There's a lot that you have asked me. I'll see if I can respond to that. I think the essays in the final part of the book are they sort of spring from two different approaches or two different sources from which the essays emerged. One is sort of outward towards the reader, where like I mentioned earlier, and like you also just mentioned, I don't think that an approach that builds on science alone can convince people or involve people in learning to appreciate nature and to work towards its conservation. Often, if you hit people with a lot of facts, and then there's so much scientific information now, you can just basically provide so much facts to people and provide the science there, but it often doesn't move people as much as some of the other forms of engagement or other ways to appreciate nature, and I think I was trying to capture some of that in the essays, because those were often also the situations that personally moved me or transformed my thinking about nature, or why I would want to continue to engage in this. And the challenge as a writer was to somehow translate that for the reader, and try to sensitize them, but not in a way that I'm just pouring information out, but more to convey an experience of what it is like when you're on a road which had these beautiful, let's say, banyan trees which were standing there for centuries, and you watch them being cut in front of you and you're powerless to do anything. Or you're on a boat and there is this whole pod of spinner dolphins that erupts out of the water, and you know that they are perhaps looking at you and thinking about you with a mind of their own, just like you are looking at them and thinking about them with a mind of their own. These sorts of connections and the is what I have tried to bring about in that part of the book. And there I feel that writing and good nature writing has a very vital role to play. And India is seeing a lot of writing in recent times in nature writing. There are a number of books coming about nature and conservation, but I still feel there is a long way to go. You have writers like Prerna Bindra, Janaki Lenin, Jay Mazumdar, several others who have written books in recent times, but there's definitely much more. And if I think about what it is that needs, I think there is a lot more that could be done in other forms of writing. For instance, immersive writing, which takes people into places and gets them to feel and see, from the perspective of the person who's also experiencing it. India has wonderful scope for it, and I think there is a lot more that can be done in that kind of writing. And I also feel we shouldn't separate out the fiction and the non-fiction as an arbitrary divide when we talk of nature writing. We have wonderful poets and fiction writers as well, and here I'm only talking about writing in English. Writing in regional languages is a whole other world about which I would not be able to say much. But there are fiction writers, poets. If you take the writing of people like Sumana Roy, Anuradha Roy, Ruskin Bond, they may be writing novels. Of course, they also write essays, but even in their novels, or closer to home, Perumal Murugan, who writes from Tamil Nadu, you find that nature has is part of the stories that they tell about people. You're not separating people from nature in this writing, and I think that is very vital. And that writing that is able to draw those connections between people and nature, and maybe even sort of revive the connections that people may have once had with nature, but now they feel disconnected, is something that's really needed. And I know that there are a lot of young people today who are writing. I've been fortunate to read many of their essays. Some of them are not yet published authors, but there is a whole lot of them out there. And I hope that if there are publishers watching this, that they will go and find them and bring their experiences out in the form of books and writings. That would make a big difference to the scenario of conservation in India.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Shankar. And yes, one gets, whilst reading your book, also a reader, she feels sort of introduced to so many other writers as well that one might have read growing up or be reading now, but sort of to make that connect. And like you said, that it's not as if writing in fiction is devoid of, the connections with nature, or how humans are placed in the larger context. And yeah, as I said, your book has so many references from poets like Rabindranath Tagore to D.H. Lawrence to Emerson, and of course the greats of nature writing from or from the environmental canon of literature, from Rachel Carson to of course from Aldo Leopold and so on. So it also, I think, gives us a lot more to think about, a lot more to want to read, really. So that for me was again something very special. The chance to actually, like you said, immerse oneself in nature, the various landscapes that you took us through, your relationships with nature, how you encouraged us as a reader to think more, and also wanting to again pick more books up and read, and both look at both the world of literature and nature as one, really. So thank you so much, Shankar. And uh, I think with that, I look forward to taking our conversation further at perhaps another discussion, another session, or at some other venue. It was fantastic that we had this opportunity today through this edition of The Value of Words, and we had Dr. Dhananjay Mohan here as well to chair the session and to give his perspectives as a professional of many years of rich experience and standing. So it's been a great pleasure, and like I said, we hope to read on more and find ourselves and our place in nature. So with that, I would like to thank both, as I said, the chair of the session, Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, as well as Dr. Tr Shankaraman for this session today, and look forward to many more such conversations.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be part of this.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Shankar. Wonderful it was.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye, Dhananjay.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
Malvika.
Bye.